Hello, everyone, and welcome to Patriot Underground. Today is June 7th, 2021. Thank you so much for joining me to discover the truth beneath the surface. Tonight, I'm going to present part 3 of my analysis and discussion of the Montauk Project. But before I begin, a quick thank you to all of my listeners. Thank you so much for all of your support. Thank you for being patient and for allowing me to grow as I embark on this journey with you. Please know that I take nothing for granted, and I will continue to work hard and do my very best to serve you in any way that I can. As time goes on, I hope to continue to bring you increasingly high quality reports and analysis. Sometimes I struggle a bit with technical issues, but a vast majority of you have been understanding and gracious, and I really do thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. So please like and subscribe and share the links with anyone you think would benefit from listening to the content. Please continue to spread awareness and assist me in building this platform in any way that you can. God bless. Okay, so let's get into it. When we ended part 2, we were discussing some of the technical components of the technology used in the Montauk Project and how Congress found out that the technology existed to control human minds and manipulate human consciousness. And as soon as they found this out, they ordered the project to be shut down, if for no other reason than self-preservation. So we pick it up tonight with Chapter 9, which discusses the beginnings of the Montauk Project. So as I've said, the technology existed, and this is the Brookhaven group we're talking about. And they had absolutely no intention of not further developing and researching the potential to control the mind with advanced technologies. So they needed to find a new home now that their funding had been cut by Congress and they were more or less forced underground. Or perhaps it's more apt to say they were forced into the arms of the military, who, when they were told a weapon could be developed that could cause the enemy to throw down their arms at the flip of a switch without even fighting, of course, they enthusiastically embraced the research, knowing full well it would have to be hidden from both the U.S. government and the American people. And it also turned out that the military had exactly the type of location and equipment necessary to continue their experimentation on Montauk Air Force Base. In particular, was the old SAGE radar that could emit frequencies between 425 to 450 megahertz that were already understood to be the quote-unquote window frequencies to accessing the ability to manipulate human consciousness. Now, Preston Nichols, of course, the author of this book, along with Peter Moon, is clear to point out that even for those who are skeptical about the facts of his story, the fact that the military was using the SAGE radar, which was originally developed in the 1950s as an early defense radar system, but was completely antiquated by this time, by the 1970s, even the early 70s. This should raise questions in everybody's mind, even those who are skeptical. Clearly, there was some clandestine project that was being carried out. That should be clear to anyone familiar with the facts involved. So the Montauk Project is really the colloquial name that was given for what was really called officially the Phoenix 2 Project. Of course, it was based upon the original Phoenix Project. So Phoenix 2 was its official name, and it began under these circumstances and was without any official oversight or knowledge of both Congress and the American people. So Nichols points out that the financing was also shrouded in mystery. Like, where did they get all the money to finance all of this advanced research? But he was told by acquaintances that the original money came from the Nazis, whom we already know didn't really face defeat in World War II. Nichols writes, quote, in 1944, an American troop train went through a French tunnel carrying $10 billion worth of Nazi gold. This train was dynamited in the tunnel while carrying 51 GIs. General George Patton was in Europe at the time and investigated this, but he couldn't understand how an American troop train could be dynamited in a Western Allied territory. As a general and human being, he cared about the GIs. The $10 billion was also a mystery, but Patton's efforts were blocked. And then Nichols continues saying, I've been told this gold eventually showed up at Montauk. And it was $10 billion of gold priced then at $20 an ounce. This was the equivalent of almost $200 billion in today's currency. And of course, this book was published a while ago. I forgot when exactly it was published. So even more money today. He continues, it was used to finance the project initially and for years to come. After it was all spent, the project was allegedly financed by the infamous Krupp family, who controlled the ITT Corporation. The Krupps were the owners of the German munition factories for World War I and II. After being found guilty of war crimes and complicity with Hitler at the Nuremberg trials, the head of the Krupp family was paroled from a light prison sentence and allowed to continue his notorious arms dealings. End quote. So a very interesting side note there about where the money came from to finance this project. So by 1971, the project was well underway and the base was restaffed with extremely stringent security protocols that were implemented to ensure secrecy of the research, of course. Nichols points out that some of this was warranted as it involved the secrets of stealth technology, in particular, the specifics of how the electromagnetic bottle that we talked about is created, which made the Eldridge disappear. This information falls under national security, as it involves the security of the United States. He reminds his readers, that being Nichols, that the stealth technology was never the issue he objected to, but rather it was the fact that this technology was being adapted to subject people to mind control without anyone's knowledge, of course, and of course without their consent, that caused Nichols to blow the whistle. He was a private contractor who came on board in 1973. The other employees were military personnel and government employees who were presumably keeping their involvement in the project top secret. So inside the building, they would place a person like Duncan Cameron. And by the way, we discussed Duncan in the previous, I think it was part 1 and 2 where we discussed Duncan. So if you haven't listened to those parts, go back and listen to it. But they would take a person like Duncan Cameron and they would put him in a chair and begin opening and closing the door to the room to determine how much microwave energy was getting in. And this was a shielded room, by the way, to supposedly protect the subject from this intense radar and from these intense frequencies. But we'll talk more about that in a second. So what they would do was they would rotate the antenna, the SAGE antenna, to a fixed point in front of the building and begin blasting gigawatts of power through the transmitter. And the purpose of this was to experiment with frequencies to see how a human subject would react. And what they found was that certain frequencies would cause people to have different emotions or exhibit different behaviors like laughing, crying, any emotion you can think of, etc., etc. It was also observed that whenever the radar was transmitting, the entire mood on the base would change. Now, the whole purpose was to study how to train and change brain waves to subject the public or certain individuals to mind control. So Nichols writes, he says, quote, this was done by changing the repetition rates of the pulse and the amplitude in correspondence to different biological functions. In this way, a person's thoughts could be controlled. With the 425 to 450 megahertz of radio frequency power, they actually had a window into the human mind. The next step would be to find out what was inside it. End quote. So just imagine the implications of this discovery and the horror that it spelled for the general public who had no idea what these evil people were up to. They realized that if frequencies were aligned with biological functions, then that person's thought forms could be harnessed and controlled. And soon they would enhance and refine their methods to be able to do just that, to acquire the ability to go inside the mind and manipulate thought directly. And Nichols then goes on to discuss the effects of this experimentation on Duncan. It was eventually determined that the exposure to these intense frequencies at such close distance, despite the shield that I mentioned a second ago intended to provide some level of protection, the exposure to these intense frequencies at such close range caused Duncan to become technically brain dead. And this was proven through brain scans. And the only reason he was able to function was on account of his amazing psychic powers. Nichols explains, quote, "The only reason Duncan is alive today is due to his strong psychic aptitude. The psychic part of his mind takes over the physical part of his mind and runs the body. His brain stem is alive, his spinal cord is alive, his body is alive, but his actual higher brain is dead. His psychic energy runs the body through the brainstem." And of course, and that's end quote. And of course, all of this brain damage that ultimately caused him to become brain dead was the result of these burning waves being shot directly at him. And eventually, the researchers discovered that if they rotated the antenna 180 degrees towards the sky and shot the burning rays outward while hitting the subject with non-burning rays, they would get all the same benefits, even enhancing their ability to access human consciousness without doing damage to the individual. But this was, of course, before Duncan's experience. This was after Duncan's experience. Duncan was one of the ones who paid a very big price. Think about the cost on all those who were experimented and killed in the process. Nichols points out that the body count is quite high. And a lot of the experimentation done on the base was done on vacationing soldiers. So different pulses and frequencies. So essentially Montauk Air Force Base had a really nice gymnasium. It had a really nice accommodations, really great food. So it was a really attractive spot for soldiers who were on furlough. So they would go there not knowing that they were guinea pigs, and really far worse. So different pulses and frequencies were transmitted, and data was collected concerning how the soldiers reacted. Nichols says, quote, "The outer base had a nice gymnasium and a bowling alley with excellent food and accommodations. Unbeknownst to the servicemen, they became guinea pigs for the mood control experiments. However, these were not the only guinea pigs. Experimentation was also done on the townspeople, in Montauk, of course, Long Island, New Jersey, upstate New York, and Connecticut civilians, just to see how far it could go. However, most experimentation was done on the vacationing soldiers." End quote. So this was a giant experiment during which a vast amount of discoveries were made about how to control thought forms. Nichols discusses how they discovered a process called frequency hopping, in which he explains, quote, "Frequency hopping consists of the transmitter instantaneously and randomly shifting around to any of 5 different frequencies that were being fed to the transmitter." End quote. So what they would do is experiment with hopping to different frequencies and monitor the reactions of the soldiers. He then continues, quote, "They discovered that the very fast frequency hops made the modulations more psychoactive. A database was then developed that would list the frequency hop times you go from one frequency to another, how they pulse modulated, the rate the pulse modulated at, the pulse width, and the power output they pulsed it at. This was then coupled with the responding effects it had. The database was very extensive and covered an extremely broad range of causes and effects. After the extensive experimentation, they developed a control panel with which they could set different pulse modulations and timings. They knew that these different pulses and functions represented certain thought patterns from the individual. They could set the modulators and timings so that a transmission would be generated that would place thought patterns into an individual. This meant they could literally set this pulse at anything they wanted and expect a desired effect to take place. End quote. So when you stop to consider the implications of this information, you can only imagine the extent to which this silent weapon has been wielded against the public. Since this whole thing started in the early 1970s, can you imagine how far it went? And the untold damage it's caused. Robbing people of the very sovereignty of their minds. Think about this. Our thought forms, our thoughts, our consciousness, and our behavior patterns have literally been not only just controlled, not only just read without our will, but actually manufactured. And this was the discovery which led to the implementation of this evil practice, which is why the Montauk Project story is so important. So then Nichols goes on to say at the end of the chapter, he says, quote, all of this took about 3 or 4 years to research. The transmitter was now fully operational and hooked up. Programs could be typed in that would put the transmitter through its phases. Programs were derived, that could change the moods of people, increase the crime rate, or make people agitated. Even animals within the vicinity were programmed to do strange things. The researchers were able to derive programs whereby they could focus on a car and stop all the electronic functions in it. He goes on to say, one day there were military vehicles riding around the base. They suddenly ceased to operate without any function. An investigation ensued to find out what was occurring with the transmitter at the time, and a program was developed. At first, the program could only get the lights in a car to dim. It was eventually refined to where the program caused all electrical functions in a vehicle to cease. Think about that. Then he says several years of research and collecting information had finally yielded a mind control device. The next objective was to create a precision technology with the material. In order to do this, help from a very strange source was enlisted. End quote. And of course, we'll find out what that very strange source was in part 4 of this series. So thank you so much for listening and taking the time to consider the horrifying implications of this experiment. And we're only getting started, by the way. So I hope you folks enjoyed. Please let me know in the comments, hit that like button and subscribe. And I will be back soon with another podcast. Until then, thanks for listening. God bless. Patriot out.